Welcome, brothers and sisters of the infinite. This is REN-SHEN Half Spirit, Chapter 3, The Tournament. It was 6 a.m. Steve had barely slept all night. So many thoughts competed for attention. Sensei Mike's tragedies, the upcoming fights, Japan. Too much to think about, and he needed to focus. His uniform, mouth guard and groin guard were ready. Most importantly, his Walkman had fresh batteries, and his favourite mixtape was ready. It was 1987, but Steve was still lost somewhere in the 1970s with his choice of music. From Deep Purple to Led Zeppelin to Black Sabbath and Free. If there wasn't a guitar tearing it apart with some wicked licks out of a Marshall stack, then it surely wasn't worth listening to. He did make one concession to the 1980s though. A new band called Guns N' Roses had taken the world by storm, and he could feel the adrenaline rushing every time he heard the guitar solo in Sweet Child of Mine. The mixtape was masterfully created, and no matter where the tape was up to, a blistering guitar solo was always nearby and ready to prime Steve for a fight. Steve's father usually slept in on Saturday mornings. His working week was tough and he usually needed the entire weekend to recover. But he was also awake on this occasion. Steve sat down with his father and told him about some of the things Sensei Mike had done. He was careful about what he told his father. Steve's dad didn't like men with tattoos. He thought they were all criminals, and he certainly didn't like anyone who had that much influence over his son. But he had a healthy respect for Sensei Mike. He saw how his son had transformed under his tutelage. Steve wasn't ready to tell his father about Japan. He thought perhaps after he won the tournament, his father would see his son's potential and let him pursue his dream. Steve's father talked about some fights he had in his youth. It wasn't easy coming to Australia back in my days. I was picked on because I couldn't speak the language when I first got here. But I didn't take any shit from anyone, even as a kid. He was convinced the mountains made him strong back in Macedonia. He never lost a fight. He looked Steve in the eyes and said, "I don't know what that tattooed hippie's taught you, but listen to me. You've got my blood and you're as strong as a bull. Control their balance and keep hitting them until you only see the white of their eyes." Steve couldn't actually disagree with his father's approach. He thought to himself, Sensei Mike has always talked about taking away the opponent's balance. Everyone's on the same page today. It's gonna be a great day. Steve and his father could barely eat, a bit of toast and some juice. Steve's dad insisted on a drink together before they left. The drink was a Macedonian staple called rakia. It probably wrecked more lives in the Balkans than any war in the region. They toasted to each other's health, na zdravje, and Steve's dad smiled and shouted, "Stefo Tsareto," or Stephen the Little King. The liquid fire burned Steve all the way down, and according to his father, he was finally ready for battle. Steve hated the alcohol, but he enjoyed bonding with his father. With his Walkman playing his favourite music and his dad driving, Steve could feel the adrenaline pumping through his body. He was completely ready to fight. Richie Blackmore, Jimmy Page, Tony Iommi, Paul Kossoff and Slash all agreed. Their guitar playing was the soundtrack for the mayhem Steve was about to unleash on his opponents. They arrived quickly and found Sensei Mike and proceeded to the registration area. The tournament organisers had a problem. This was an adults tournament, and Steve would not turn 18 until a few days after the tournament. Technically, he was underage, and he would need authority from a parent or guardian in order to fight. That was solved quickly as Steve's father authorised his son. There wasn't much else to do but get ready to fight. Numerous martial arts clubs representing all styles from all around Australia gathered in their groups around the stadium. There were more than 200 fighters registered for the event. Formalities were completed quickly, and it wasn't long before the fighting was ready to begin. Steve had a couple of his club brothers who were also competing, and they all sat together with Sensei Mike, wondering who they might face in the first round. A late arrival entered the stadium. It was a group of 10 fighters all dressed in black, and their trainer who was wearing a hooded top and sunglasses. They were all noticeably muscular, with one even more muscular fighter who was as tall as his hooded trainer. Compared to the others in the stadium, they looked infinitely more serious. Even Sensei Mike seemed to reposition himself, trying to get a good look at them. Steve managed to read their club's symbol, a simple kanji character meaning sakura or cherry blossom. Steve, perhaps to comfort himself and his team, said, "Look at those losers. Other teams are called karate warriors and kung fu dragons and taekwondo knights. And those guys in black are the cherry blossoms." Sensei Mike quickly changed the mood and reminded everyone, cherry blossoms are a very powerful symbol to the Japanese. They symbolize many things, but often mean life is short and have a whole lot more meaning than some of those other silly names. He pulled up his sleeve to remind his team of the cherry blossoms tattooed on his arm. The black team was already in Steve's head, and Steve's father also noticed them and pointed them out to Steve with a simple raise of his eyebrows and a tilt of his head towards them. 3 of Sensei Mike's team were to fight, and as luck would have it, Jake was the very first fight. Jake was almost Sensei Mike's age and had practiced other martial arts before starting with Sensei Mike. He was a strong man and good fighter, but sometimes he would lapse back into his older styles, which were inferior to Sensei's style. He was up against one of the cherry blossoms. Steve and Sensei Mike were both eager to see how the cherry style would measure up against their style. Judges sat in each corner of the designated fight area. They held 2 flags of colours which matched the belts given to each contestant. Jake was given a blue belt to wear and the cherry was given a red belt. The referee in the middle gave clear instructions. This is full contact. No gloves are worn. Kicking to the head is allowed, but punches to the head are not. No kicks to the groin, and fighting must stop as soon as the referee yells stop. You will fight 2 4-minute rounds with a 1-minute break in between. The fighters understood and bowed to the referee and took their positions. The referee instructed the fighters to bow to each other. Jake assumed the normal bow, and his opponent, who was simply called Cherry Blossom 7, did an unusual bow. He was already in his fighting stance, but his bow was nothing more than a momentary drop of his hands to his sides while lowering his head. His eyes never left Jake. The referee ordered the fight to begin, and Jake was amazing. He charged forward with a perfect front kick, which crashed through Cherry 7's defences, which seemed to surprise him. He bounced right out of the designated area, and the judges in the corners held up the blue flags to unanimously award Jake the point. Jake's entire team was elated, and even Sensei Mike seemed to look a little more relaxed. The fighters were brought back to their starting positions and ordered to fight again. Jake attempted the same front kick, and this time Cherry 7 simply moved to the side and did a roundhouse kick straight to Jake's head. The judges all raised their red flags to acknowledge the point. Jake was a strong man, and he managed to stay upright, but he looked a little shaky. At that point, Cherry 7 was well aware of Jake's condition and proceeded to pummel him with a fury of punches. Jake seemed to lapse back into his old styles and lost the ability to absorb and deflect. The fight finished quickly. Cherry 7 prevailed and was awarded the win when Jake could no longer continue. Jake returned to the group and apologised to his entire team. He knew he let the team down. Sensei Mike comforted Jake briefly and said, "You did well in the beginning, Jake. That fighter was very good. Don't be too hard on yourself. Learn from this." Jake was despondent, and the team definitely lost a little enthusiasm and confidence for a few minutes. Steve put his headphones back on and tried to regain his focus. It didn't help seeing the cherry blossoms dominating the ensuing fights. Soon it was Max's turn. He was an excellent fighter. He only started training 1 year earlier and was showing great promise. He was a Polish boy from the same neighbourhood as Steve. Even though he was a couple of years older than Steve, he was Steve's younger brother in the dojo. They got on very well, even outside of the dojo. The Polish and Macedonian boys were often surprised to learn their languages shared many similar words. Steve would jokingly call Max the crazy German when he wanted to annoy him during sparring sessions. Nobody understood better than Steve how upsetting it was to have some doubt thrown at you about your own identity. Max's kata was not so well developed, and Steve wondered if Max's fighting form would hold up when placed under pressure. He needn't have worried. He was fighting against one of the karate warrior fighters. The fight went the full 2 rounds only because Max was enjoying it too much. His skills were far too advanced for his opponent. Even though he had only been training for 1 year, he fought like a seasoned professional. He finished the fight without even a scratch. Sensei Mike, surprisingly, was not completely pleased with Max's effort. He said, "You wasted techniques on your opponent and you were lucky he wasn't fitter. If you started to get tired, he might have actually had a chance to beat you." He still patted him on the back and said, "Well done though, a very good effort, especially for someone who's only trained for 1 year. Steve was ecstatic for his crazy Polak dojo brother. They were all sitting together in a group when a Cherry Blossom fighter was up. He was Cherry Blossom 1 and he was scheduled to fight one of the Taekwondo fighters. Both were tall men and looked equally matched in muscularity. This fight was going to be fun. The fight started and the Taekwondo guy was amazing. He jumped in the air and completed a perfect spinning kick. For any martial artist, it was a delight to watch. His foot landed perfectly on Cherry 1's face and knocked him straight on top of one of the corner judges. The chair broke into pieces and the judge needed some medical attention. Cherry 1 didn't look too bad after the hit. In fact, he looked the same as before the fight started. He was menacing. The Cherry Blossom trainer moved out of the shadows for a moment and motioned over to Cherry 1 to whisper in his ear. It was still impossible to get a good look at the trainer and it started to irk Sensei Mike a little. He thought it was somewhat disrespectful to be covering his head and wearing sunglasses inside the stadium. The fight was ready to start again. The referee started the fight and the Taekwondo guy went straight in for another kick. He chose to deploy a roundhouse kick. Cherry 1 immediately stepped in towards his opponent, blocked the kick as if to swat a fly and punched his opponent in the chest. It didn't look particularly amazing, but everyone in the stadium heard the hit. The reaction was immense. He seemed to knock the will to fight out of his opponent. He dropped to the ground clutching his chest and unable to breathe. He was carried off on a stretcher to the medical room for attention. Cherry 1 proceeded to the next round. After a few more fights, it was Steve's turn, and if normal people had butterflies in their stomachs when they were nervous, then Steve had an entire butterfly farm inside his stomach. He had so much nervous energy and Sensei Mike grabbed him to help him center himself. He said, "Steve, this is just another lesson. You'll be fine. Just don't stray from our way. If you follow what I've taught you, you'll be fine. The other guys didn't follow our way fully. I know you will." Steve was up against a Cherry Blossom. Cherry Blossom 2 was almost as big as Cherry 1. Jake and Max both encouraged Steve to finish him fast. Steve was impressed with every single one of the Cherry Blossoms. They were militant in the way they dealt with their opponents. The precision and power they displayed looked like they were trained by Sensei Mike himself. Steve managed to squeeze in a quick listen to one more inspirational guitar solo by Richie Blackmore of Deep Purple and had Smoke on the Water playing in his head before making his way to the fight area. Sensei Mike walked with him and Steve saw his father following closely behind his sensei. Steve said, "Dad, I'm not sure if you're allowed to come to the fight area. I think it's only for the fighters and instructors." His father surveyed the area and looked at Sensei Mike and said, "Son, I'm pretty sure no one would dare try to stop me." Sensei Mike smiled and seemed to enjoy the obvious love and connection between father and son. Cherry 2 was closely followed by his hooded trainer. It looked as if his trainer was floating next to him and whispering instructions. Previously, the trainer always stayed back away from the fighters and away from the strong lights, but this time it seemed as though he also wanted to be part of the fight. Sensei Mike noticed this also and seemed to grow increasingly uneasy, and Steve was feeling the tension from every angle. It was time to fight. Steve had been training so hard, and Goju-Ryu had been his waking thought every day since he started. And that was after dreaming about it every night. Steve lined up and Cherry 2 faced him with a menacing glare. Steve, in contrast, returned a humble look and what may have even been a hint of a smile. There was no point in giving his opponent any indication of his intent. If Cherry 2 knew Steve's intent, he would have long gone out of the stadium already. They bowed to the referee and then to each other. Cherry 2 didn't even lower his arms from his fighting stance. He just bowed his head ever so slightly at Steve, as if only to comply but certainly not respect the rules. The fight started and Steve unleashed in a way that shocked everyone in his club, including Sensei Mike. They'd never seen such ferocity in Steve before. Steve was always kind and respectful in the club. He meted out his attacks with precision and humility in the dojo. There was no point in getting angry with his fellow students, and there certainly wasn't ever going to be any sign of disrespect to Sensei Mike. But the fight was different. Steve allowed himself to unleash that power within him. He charged forward with nothing more than a simple sidekick, but his kiai, the short shout made during an attacking move, created a virtual tidal wave. A normal kiai would come from the diaphragm and attempt to connect the martial artist's energy to his technique. In this case, it seemed to come from somewhere even deeper, and everybody in the entire stadium reacted to it. Steve even looked like he was riding on that tidal wave when he kicked Cherry 2. Steve's opponent didn't just fall backwards, he was propelled into the stadium seating, where all the spectators were. The referee stopped the fight and waited to see if Cherry 2 could come back to the contest. He was helped back into the arena and looked pale yet stable enough. The referee gestured in a way to indicate the fighters should return to their starting positions. Steve turned away from his opponent, and at precisely the same time, he heard the Cherry trainer spitting words he actually understood from Sensei Mike. These were some old Okinawan words that Sensei would joke and say when they were sparring together, but in this case they sounded utterly evil and almost demonic. Before he realised what was happening, he heard a shriek and felt a slap to the side of his face, and he couldn't see out of one eye. His opponent had attacked him from behind, before the fight had even recommenced. It was highly illegal, and all the corner judges immediately thrusted both flags in the air in a crossed formation. Cherry 2 was disqualified for his action. Meanwhile, Steve was on the ground, cupping his eye with his hand. The audience started to boo him. They thought perhaps he was dramatising the event a little too much. He stood up with his hand over his eye to see the audience turn on him. By that stage, he had collected his thoughts and the pain had subsided. He removed his hand, covering his eye, and then became increasingly concerned after the audience's boos and hisses turned into oohs and ahs. He saw all the blood in his hand and realised his face was covered in blood. His eyebrow had been split apart. He was taken to the medics immediately. They laid him down and cleaned up the wound. He heard two people nearby talking, and one said stitches would be required. He then heard another say he wouldn't be allowed to fight if he had stitches. Steve screamed, "No stitches, no stitches!" He needed to fight and redeem himself. The medics had a solution. They taped the wound together and bandaged him up and said he'd be able to continue the fight. Steve was truly devastated. He had too much to prove and wasn't allowed the chance to show his sensei and his father how strong and capable he was. The combination of adrenaline and shock and disappointment was too much for him. He couldn't return to his group. He couldn't even look at his father. He felt ashamed. He shouldn't have turned away from his opponent, and he should have understood that trainer's hateful intent immediately. He sat quietly in the auditorium and quietly cried to himself for a moment. He couldn't understand why he was feeling so bad. The last time he felt so bad and empty inside was when his mother died, such a long time ago. It was almost as terrible to him, and he couldn't understand why. A little girl whom he hadn't even noticed before poked him in the leg. She was sitting on his right-hand side next to him. She asked him, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" Steve looked at her. Initially, he only saw the left side of her face and remarked to himself, "So cute. She looks like a little angel." She had blonde hair and was tiny, and her voice sounded like a little bird to Steve. He summoned a smile and said, "Oh, forget it. I'm just a little upset with myself. I should have done better, and I shouldn't be injured now, and I think I let everyone down." So many words fell out of Steve's mouth. The little girl kept poking at his leg, and Steve stopped. She said, "Listen, I saw you fight, and you looked so strong. Everyone said you looked like you'd win the entire tournament. You have no reason to cry. I cried for years when this happened to me." She turned her face fully towards Steve and showed her burn marks on her face. It almost looked like she'd been branded. The entire right-hand side was disfigured and certainly not as pretty as on her left side. She continued, "I cried because this really hurt. My whole family cried because they couldn't help me. I was trying to help my family and I got burned. It really hurt a lot. It still hurts. So I don't think you should cry. I think you should be proud of how strong you were in that battle of good versus evil. And I think the people that love you will cry if you cry. So please stop. I've always thought, I think you're going to be great." Steve was so humbled, and he felt completely elevated from his physical self for a brief moment. He grasped this girl's true beauty, something that would last forever in his mind. He told her she was right and thanked her profusely. The last time he felt so comforted was when his mother was still alive. It felt exactly the same as his mother's warm words of encouragement when he was a child. It was so beautiful that it felt like they were in a bubble of serenity for an eternity, even though it was no more than a minute. She helped him more than perhaps she even realised. He asked her name. She said, "I am Temyana, and I can't wait to see you win this tournament." Steve was genuinely pleased to meet this little angel. He said goodbye and started heading back. He turned around looking for little Temyana, and she was already gone. He went to his father, sensei, and teammates, and they welcomed him warmly. They told him how amazing his kick was, and they had never seen him show so much ferocity. Steve felt so grateful to that little girl and kept turning around to find her in the audience, but he could never spot her. The cherry blossoms were either winning or cheating, or both, and they were the ones to fear on a number of levels. Cherry 1 had won 2 more fights with nothing more than a punch in each of them. Steve had never seen such a display of power like that before. Steve and Max completed a couple more fights against some other karate clubs from interstate and managed to win easily. They were not wasteful with their techniques and didn't receive any injuries. Sensei Mike looked much more pleased with his students. Later in the afternoon, it was Max's turn again. This time he had to face a Cherry Blossom. Cherry Blossom 5 had been technically fighting within the rules, but he wasn't doing it within the spirit of the event. None of the Cherry Blossoms were likeable, but Cherry 5 was particularly despicable. He would aim at the joints of his opponents and try to break them at every opportunity. The fight started and Max had the perfect reply to every one of Cherry 5's attacks. Max saw a chance and went in with a sweep to Cherry 5's leg. It was so powerful. Cherry 5 immediately shrieked and held his knee. He was hurt, and it was a shame the round had finished because Max would have had a chance to really finish him off. During the break between the rounds, Sensei Mike was rubbing Max's legs and keeping him motivated. He told Max what a great job he was doing and how he couldn't fault his fighting in this fight. Cherry 5 now had a weakness. His left leg was going to be a problem for him, and Max knew he must take advantage of that. Steve didn't take his eyes away from Cherry 5 and his trainer. The trainer looked like a bat flapping its wings around Cherry 5. He looked angry, and it was obvious he wasn't encouraging his student at all. He was admonishing him, and he even slapped him across the face. It was disgusting to watch, and Steve almost felt sorry for Cherry 5. Steve noticed something quite odd. The trainer reached inside Cherry 5's gi, and it looked as though he gave him something. Steve ran over to Max and Sensei Mike and warned them. He wanted Max to know that his opponent might do something illegal and to be ready for anything. Cherry 5 limped to his fighting mark, and Max, the crazy Polak, bounced to his mark. Round 2 started and Max immediately went for Cherry 5's injured leg. Cherry 5 sidestepped effectively and managed to hit Max with a few punches. But Max's skills were nothing short of sensational. He intercepted the strikes, performed a takedown of his opponent, and then slammed him on the ground. Cherry 5 held onto him and Max was almost on top of him. The referee ordered a stop to the fight and went to separate Max from Cherry 5, and at the same time Max let out a scream. He stood up and his eyes were bleeding and his mouth was frothing. Steve saw Cherry 5 put his hand inside his gi as though he was returning something there. Steve lost all his sensibilities and ran into the fighting area to protect his dojo brother, and with a blind rage he grabbed Cherry 5. He tried to reach inside Cherry 5's gi to see what he used to make Max so violently ill. While this was happening, he heard the same hissing in the old Okinawan as previously. Cherry 1 stepped forward and tried to grab Steve. Steve was much more ready this time and easily evaded Cherry 1's attempts to grab him. Cherry 1 came back at Steve, but Steve's father had already arrived. He grabbed Steve and pulled him back behind him. He glared at every blossom with particular attention to the trainer and Cherry 1. Sensei Mike let the medics take over looking after Max and turned his attention to Steve's father. He knew that look. He knew what a strong and angry man was capable of doing and quickly stepped next to him ready for anything. The referee and a few other officials entered the area and quickly diffused the tension. The corner judges congregated and made their decision. Cherry 5 was disqualified. Max was awarded the win and Steve was issued a stern warning. It was indeed a Pyrrhic victory for Max. He won the fight, but he would not be able to continue fighting. His vision was blurry and the poison he was given seemed to drain his energy. Sensei Mike thought it was best for Max to go to hospital, even though he could barely see and he was slumped over his chair. He flatly refused. "No way in the world am I leaving, Sensei. I'm not going anywhere while these sons of bitches are here," he said. It was abundantly clear Max was not going anywhere. It was less clear why the officials had not noticed the full extent of the Cherry team's skullduggery. It seemed the only ones who could grasp the magnitude of their mischief were the fighters and trainers who had faced the Cherry Blossoms. In no time there were only 4 competitors left, and Steve was one of them. He was eager to learn who he would be fighting. By that stage, everybody was a good fighter and had something unique that enabled them to reach the semi-finals. Cherry 1 was there, as expected. And so were two other competent fighters. One was from the Kung Fu Dragons, and the other from a very unique Indonesian style called Pencak Silat. Every one of them were very good fighters, and Steve knew he couldn't take any of those fighters lightly. They deserved his respect, and he would need his best abilities to win. Steve was up against the Kung Fu Dragon, and the Blossom would be fighting the Silat guy. Everybody used to joke about the Kung Fu fighters. They would call them the bean curds. Bean curd can look like a polished stone, so solid and hard, but slapping it will cause it to disintegrate. Well, that was the case with many of the earlier fighters in the tournament, but this guy was different. He was so light on his feet and almost elegant in the way he won his fights. Sensei Mike was quick to instruct Steve about him. This guy knows the soft way, but he can hit also. Don't let him get you off balance. Steve spent the previous 2 years thinking nothing was better than his style, and much to his genuine surprise, he saw other fighters who were actually quite amazing. Deep down, Steve remained sure his style was the best, but the world seemed a little bigger than it had before the tournament. Steve and the Dragon would be fighting first. Sensei Mike was pleased and reminded Steve he would have more time to recover for the grand final. Steve was happy with that information, but then thought to himself, yeah, well, I still got to win this fight first. The fight started and Steve didn't hesitate. He unleashed his frightening kiai and attempted a front kick against the Dragon. The Dragon barely moved but avoided the kick, and at the same time managed to push Steve's hip and land a powerful punch to Steve's rib. He got him good. Steve was sore and a little shocked. He moved back to the starting position and managed to glance back at both Sensei Mike and his father. He knew, and they knew, the Dragon had messed with his balance and won that contest. The fight started again and Steve went in for a punch. The Dragon just waved his hand around and managed to control Steve's arm and almost lift him off the ground at the same time. The Dragon then used both hands to bounce Steve out of the fighting area. Another point awarded to the Dragon. He could hear the Blossoms laughing at him. Steve was going crazy. He was not going to lose. Then it occurred to him, Sensei Mike would often infuriate him in precisely the same way when they would spar. The more angry Steve became, the stiffer his body became, and the easier it was for Sensei Mike to control him. Steve needed to go soft, not harder. Steve made his way back to the starting position. He didn't dare look at his father or Sensei Mike. At the starting position, Steve took a moment to quickly perform a breathing movement and center himself. The fight began again and Steve did not initiate an attack this time. He waited for the Dragon. The Dragon moved forward and Steve forced himself to relax. His feet were hanging onto the ground like an eagle holding its prey, but the rest of him was gentle and calm and ready to absorb and deflect. Dragon initiated a flurry of punches and Steve used a round movement with his hands to catch them all, as though he was collecting fireflies in a net. He then punched back in combination with one of his powerful kiais. Dragon received the full force of it. He was an excellent fighter, but he was not ready for Steve's power. Steve kept going, punching and kicking, and mindful of the boundaries of the fighting area, he made sure he kept Dragon within the boundary. He'd even pull him in sometimes so he wouldn't go outside the boundary. The Dragon instructor threw a towel into the fight, and the fight stopped. Steve had won. Steve admired the Dragon and went over and wished him well. Dragon was very noble in defeat. He said, "It was like you became a different fighter. You completely changed styles halfway through the fight. You were better than me. I learned something today and I thank you for this. Good luck." Steve was humbled by how gracious and polite his adversary was. He thanked him and also thanked Dragon's trainer. Steve was elated and quickly went back to his team. Sensei Mike said he saw the change and was confident Steve would adapt to defend against Dragon's style. Steve's father looked concerned. He said, "How's your rib?" Steve had forgotten about it right up until then. He checked himself and, ouch, it hurt. He thought to himself. At the same time as he winced, he glanced over at the Blossoms and they were all looking at him. "Oh, brilliant. Now Frankenblossom is going to go straight for my injured rib," Steve said. Sensei Mike reminded Steve that Cherry 1 was going to have to win his fight first. Cherry 1 and the Pencak Silat guy quickly assembled in the fighting area. The fight looked uneven. Silat was half the size of Cherry One. It was not going to be good. Silat went over to shake Cherry One's hand, and Cherry One just pushed him away and snarled at him. Silat just smiled and went back to his fighting position, while everyone in the audience booed Cherry One. The fight started and Cherry One stepped forward and launched one of his trademark punches that had been used so effectively up until then. Silat was amazing. He literally jumped towards that punch and held onto it while he launched both feet into the midriff of Cherry One. He looked like an angry monkey. And the only thing better than that double kick was the look of shock on Cherry One's face. Silat landed gently on his feet, crouching down, looking like a cobra ready to spit its venom at Cherry One. Cherry One was enraged. He tried to stomp his foot on top of Silat as if to squash a bug, but Silat jumped out of the way again and managed to steal some punches between those tree trunks of arms of Cherry One. He was incredible, so light and fast. Steve even began to think about the best strategy he would need to use if he was going to have to fight him. Silat initiated an attack this time. He sprung up from a coiled snake position and aimed his fists at Cherry One's abdomen. Cherry One anticipated the attack. He swatted Silat in an upward motion, and his open palm struck Silat to the chest and slid up to his face. Silat looked like he was electrocuted as he flew out of the fighting area. His face was covered in blood as he wearily stood up and made his way back to the start position. Two corner judges held out their flags to disqualify Cherry One for an illegal hit to the face. The fighters waited at their start positions and the judges and referee met together to confer. The referee then advised everyone Cherry One's hand appeared to slip upwards towards Silat's face due to the way Silat had moved, and therefore it was not illegal. Cherry One was awarded the point. Silat looked a little shaky after that hit to the head. Cherry One was immensely strong and he usually only needed one good hit to win a fight. Silat was doing very well, but Steve began to wonder what would happen after he took that knock. The medics cleaned him up a little and managed to stop his bleeding nose. They allowed the fight to continue as there was no other obvious injuries. Silat luckily had a little time to recover before the fight recommenced. When the referee ordered the fight to start again, Silat was moving around very well. He managed to evade Cherry One every time he made a move towards him. But Silat seemed reluctant to initiate an attack. Perhaps he began to fear being hit like that again. He kept moving around and evading his opponent. Soon it became a game for him and the crowd was cheering his evasive abilities. Cherry One couldn't seem to get close enough. Finally, with Silat's confidence again restored, he became the cobra. Coiled up and hissing, he was preparing for attack. This time, Cherry One feigned another foot stomp. As soon as Cherry One raised his knee, Silat jumped upwards to spit his venom. Cherry One dropped his foot to the side and punched downward with the most evil and guttural kiai. Silat's snake-like hands were no match for this massive display of power. Cherry One's fist crashed through Silat's defences and crushed through Silat's collarbone, snapping it as though it was a piece of chalk. Silat was splayed on the ground in a mess. Everyone heard the crack as Silat was hit, and it was clear he wasn't going to get up. Impressively, Silat stood up immediately. He walked straight to his starting position and then assumed a fighting stance. He went to raise his arms and only one arm went up. The referee seemed to be wondering if the fight could continue. Silat managed to stand upright a few more seconds before the adrenaline seemed to wear off. Then he just dropped to the ground and everybody in the stadium, except the Blossoms, sighed with a mixture of concern and disappointment. Cherry One had won and it was going to be Cherry One versus Steve in the grand final. The Blossoms seemed to shriek at the same time and looked over at Steve. They're such an ugly bunch of pricks, Steve thought to himself, especially Frank and Blossom. The grand final would be held after the kata and weapons final. Steve had developed excellent weapons skills under Sensei Mike and his kata was perfect. But the test for Steve was for fighting. He had no desire to compete in the other events. The events were interesting to watch. Every style had their specialties and some were truly remarkable to watch. Steve couldn't focus on them. His mind remained focused on the impending fight. Cherry One was a fierce opponent and Steve was trying to think of what he could do to beat him. You have an answer for anything he will try on you. You know that, right? Said Sensei Mike. Steve paused and seemed less than confident in that moment. Frankenblossom is a beast of a man, but I'll try my best. If I lose, I'll hopefully learn something, and if I win, I'll have only you to thank, Sensei Mike. In fact, I can't even believe I made it this far. Thank you, Sensei Mike. You've changed my life forever. No matter what happens in the next fight, I'm so grateful for everything you've done for me. Sensei Mike just patted him on the shoulder and said, remember, this is just training. Another lesson for you. Losing can sometimes mean you win in the end. Steve didn't even want to hear the L word. He didn't want to hear anyone mention losing again. Of course, Jake and Max were next to come up and congratulate Steve. You did so well to make it to the final, Steve. Don't worry if you lose. Frankenblossom is a full-grown man and you're only 17 years old. You'd smash that ugly bastard by the time you're 25. It wouldn't even be a competition, said Jake, while Max wholeheartedly agreed. Steve was starting to get really annoyed. Steve's father put one of his strong hands on his shoulder and it strangely seemed to energize him. Don't forget, you're a lion, and if you want to win, it's waiting for you, Steve's father said. They smiled at each other for a brief moment. So many years together, and they could just look at each other and understand every word not said. Steve grasped all of his father's intent and wishes in that moment. He never wanted anything more than this in his life. He would give it his all. Steve sat down and put his headphones on. Luckily, he brought some extra batteries because he was getting his money's worth out of his Walkman during the tournament. On came Black Sabbath with the song Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. When the guitars came screaming through after a defiant Ozzy Osbourne vocally gave the finger to his oppressors in the song, Steve was ready to punch holes through walls, maybe even through time dimensions. Losing was not an option. Not at all. He threw off the headphones and started stretching and warming up. He was ready for anything. The displays and carders had all finished and the fight area was ready. It was time. Sensei Mike asked Steve's dad to come with him. Sensei Mike knew he had no choice, so he made Steve's dad carry some towels to look official. Steve walked ahead and had almost reached the fight area when he looked up and saw Cherry 1 and his trainer. Steve was horrified. The trainer had pulled down his hood and taken off his sunglasses and his eyes were just plain black. And his face was hideous and his hands were long and they looked like claws. And his teeth were sharp. He didn't even look human. Steve turned around to see if Sensei Mike and his dad had seen that hideous creature. Sensei Mike sprinted towards Steve. Steve had never seen Sensei look so agitated before. Sensei Mike said, Steve, listen to me carefully. I don't want you to fight. We must leave immediately. You must not fight. This isn't right. This can't. Then some wicked amalgam of thunder and whispers emanated from that hideous creature for all to hear. Brother Mike, you don't want to play with your brother Hiro? Let us see who made the strongest fighter. Let us see who walks out of here. Steve understood immediately. This was Hiro, Sensei Mike's former training partner. Sensei Mike was pale. He looked sick. Nothing normally fazed him, but this wasn't nothing. This was horror personified. Sensei Mike's mind was racing. Is this what my sensei was talking about? He damaged Hiro when he summoned Lorham? What the hell has Hiro become? A demon? It's as if his thoughts were interrupted. That hideous creature whispered again, yes, Brother Mike, I've indeed changed. Maybe I still even have some human in me. I've missed you and I want you by my side, the same as before. Let us be together, again. I promise you will enjoy it when I make you the same as me. Sensei Mike grabbed Steve and said, we must go. Steve had so much adrenaline racing through him at this point. He wanted to fight and he begged Sensei Mike for the chance. Sensei Mike said, Steve, this is not training now. Please understand, you, all of us, will be fighting for our lives here. We need to get out and make plans. He was interrupted. Son. Steve's dad had the most gentle smile as he looked upon Steve. Son, you're a king with the heart of a lion. Show him who we are. Win the fight and together we'll do whatever needs to be done after. Steve's dad never looked so huge to him before. He seemed to radiate power and confidence, and Steve seemed to be nourished by it. He looked like a king. Even Sensei Mike seemed to calm down after Steve's dad talked. Steve turned to Sensei Mike and said, Sensei Mike, I've got to do this. You said I'll learn about myself. When I take away a win from someone else, I must do this for myself. Steve turned and surged forward and stood on his fighting position. Cherry 1 thumped his hulking frame to his fighting position. Cherry One was a head taller than Steve and his body seemed twice as thick. The referee seemed oblivious to what was going on at each end of the fighting area. He asked his fighters to fight fair and they bowed in their own ways to him. Cherry One bowed like a disrespectful thug and Steve bowed in his traditional fashion. They both bowed to each other from a fighting stance this time. Steve didn't care about tradition at that point. The thug doesn't deserve my respect and I'm not going to give him even a microsecond of advantage, he thought to himself. The fight began and Cherry One pointed at Steve and told him he would kill him. Steve didn't waste any time. He summoned all of his power and kicked a sweep into Cherry One's leg. This was usually the kind of attack that left an opponent limping around and would drain the opponent's desire to continue fighting. In classes, Steve's training partners would hold 3 pads next to their legs and Steve would still make them limp away when he kicked them. Well, on this occasion, Steve landed the perfect hit and it seemed as though time stood still for a moment. Then Cherry One merely took a step forward and roared as though nothing had happened. The hideous demon hero squealed with delight and hissed and shrieked at the same time. Steve was demoralised. He didn't feel doubt, but he felt scared, and he knew his job wasn't going to be easy. Cherry One launched his fist at Steve, and it sounded as though Demon Hero's hisses were fueling his attack. Steve's combination of adrenaline, speed, strength, and quite frankly, fear were the perfect mix. He managed to block the punches unleashed upon him and started to feel his confidence return as his well-trained body and mind adapted to the monster in front of him. But he very quickly realised Cherry One would eventually get through if he didn't begin his own attack. Cherry One was big and had a longer reach than Steve. If Cherry One was in range to punch, Steve would need to find a way to move even closer before he could return a punch. In a split second, he realised what he needed to do. He would kick, and when he finished one kick, he would kick again. He would not stop kicking until the fight was over, and the fight was not going to be over until Steve won. Steve didn't even give a moment's thought to the physicality required for this strategy. A single kick probably drained as much energy as 4 punches. He decided it was the best option. At worst, the kicks would keep that monster away from him, and at best, they would hurt him and give Steve the win he so desperately wanted. At the same time as Steve launched his barrage of kicks, Cherry One was managing to make it through with his trademark savage punches. One of the punches hit Steve precisely in the injured rib from the previous fight, and even Steve was expecting it to hurt. Curiously, none of the punches hurt as much as Steve was anticipating. In fact, some simple physics was at play. Steve's kicks were hitting Cherry One at the same time as some of his punches were landing on Steve. They were negating each other. Steve was landing almost twice as many kicks as Cherry One was punching. Any observer would have logically thought Steve would tire soon, but he kept going. And between the frenzy of kicks, an occasional punch would thread its way through and send Steve back 1 metre, only to have Steve charge back in with even more kicks. The timer sounded and it was the end of the first round. Steve sat down and Sensei Mike was doing everything in his power to help Steve regain his breath. Steve looked over at that disgusting demon who was furious at his protege. He was shrieking at him and hissing and weaving around Cherry One as if to imbue more of his evil into him. Steve turned to look at his father. He was leaning forward and smiling in a deep discussion with somebody. Who was that person? What? Temyana, the sweet little angel who humbled and encouraged him. This time she was wearing a golden half mask covering her burns. He thought to himself, what the? They look like they know each other. This is crazy, as he focused his mind back on the war about to recommence. Sensei Mike reminded Steve with a tap to his face. Listen, he said, that demon will not let his fighter lose. He will do anything for the win. You saw what they did to Max. They will try something, anything, whatever it takes for them to hurt you. Please be careful. Steve assured his sensei that he understood the gravity of the situation and wouldn't let his guard down. The fighters were called back for the second round. Steve was ready for anything, but he wasn't ready for what he saw. Cherry One actually bowed properly to the referee and to Steve. Steve bowed from his fighting stance, and for a moment he felt he was being disrespectful. But as his opponent rose from his traditional bow, he noticed something which horrified him. The hands he held to his side were changing as they raised into a fighting position. They darkened, and by the time they moved that short distance to their fighting position, transformed into hideous black claws. The referee seemed oblivious to this, and the spectators didn't even seem to notice either. Steve was incredulous. That disgusting man mountain was mutating before his eyes, and nobody else seemed to be able to see it. The fight started and Cherry One thundered towards Steve. His feet were thumping the ground and his talons were waving in front of him. One managed to reach Steve's blocking arm and rip through his gi and drew blood. Steve was acutely aware of everything around him. He could feel Sensei Mike's concern behind him, and he swore he could hear that little girl behind him talking to his father. He thought to himself, why are they still talking? Can't they see I'm fighting for my bloody life against this filthy monster? Steve was kicking furiously again. He was trying to avoid the talons of that man monster, but sometimes his foot would be intercepted by those claws and his feet were becoming increasingly bloodied. Cherry One wasn't even looking tired. He seemed to enjoy seeing Steve's blood, and the hissing from Demon Hero seemed to be congratulating his protege. Steve refused to even think about losing. He was fighting for his life here. Cherry One managed to shoot forward at an uncharacteristic speed, which shocked Steve. Cherry One grabbed him and pulled him close with those evil claws. Steve had excellent flexibility and from such a close position executed a perfect roundhouse to Cherry One's head. Something peculiar occurred. Steve's feet were an absolute mess of blood due to those talons ripping them apart. His kick to Cherry One's face left some blood on his face, an eye, and they started to emit a foul smoke. It clearly gave Cherry One some pain. He let go of Steve and stepped back and wiped his face with his claws. His face had deformed slightly, but he regained his composure soon enough. For the first time, Steve actually noticed his own breathing. He was a machine operating on pure adrenaline, but even that would run out eventually. He remembered an old trick he used once with success against Sensei Mike. Steve pretended to look tired. He lowered his hands from his regular fighting position and slumped his shoulders and sucked a whole lot more in. All the telltale signs of someone reaching the end of their physical capacity. Cherry One saw Steve's diminished condition and found himself some new vigour. He charged towards Steve with his claws ready to rip Steve's head off. Steve didn't waste a moment. He yelled his kiai and launched his sidekick. The kiai was even more impressive than the one he did in his first fight. It looked like he directed an earthquake straight at his opponent. The sound reverberated through the entire stadium like an explosion, and the kick was a missile launch. Steve flew through the air, and Cherry One, with his wicked smile, was moving forward with his claws up and ready. But Steve unleashed a power that seemed beyond human. His foot was shredded as it crashed through the claws and landed on Cherry One's upper chest and then slid up his throat. Such was the power of the kick. Cherry One's throat seemed to collapse and he was left gasping for air. He wrapped his claws around his throat to try to understand why he couldn't breathe. Steve kept going. He hit that man monster with a barrage of kicks and punches until he was knocked out of the ring. The fight was over and Steve had won. The judge awarded Steve the win and he was sure he jumped as high as the auditorium roof with his fist clenched in victory. He did win. He took away that win from that man monster and he made his sensei Mike and father proud of him. Most importantly, Steve was proud of himself. Sensei Mike, Steve's father, and Jake and Max came to congratulate him. It was completely surreal, and Steve didn't hear a word they said to him. Among all that frenzied excitement, Steve asked his father if he actually knew that little girl he was talking to earlier, and his reply was, "I haven't seen her for a very long time. I've known her all my life." Steve was perplexed, but he didn't have time to think about it as they all lifted him in the air and pronounced him the winner to the auditorium. They paid particular attention to turning Steve around to face the cherry blossoms, who were all hissing and scowling at him. Sensei Mike still looked uncharacteristically agitated and quickly calmed the group. He said, "This is not over yet, guys. Keep your wits about you, because anything is possible. The trophy presentation is about to happen, so stay close and be careful. We can celebrate later." With that message, the group made their way to the presentation area and sat down. Steve's dad wasn't even a step away from the group when Steve turned around and grabbed his old man and pulled him in for a hug. They were laughing and they walked the rest of the way with their arms draped over each other's shoulders. Well, that was fun, wasn't it? Different fighting styles all competing against each other. Big guys versus little guys, fast guys versus slow guys who are very strong. What do you do when you've come across different opponents like that from different styles? This is great fun. We had some supernatural events occurring during this bout right near the end of that chapter. we started to see fighters growing talons. Cherry 1 looked a bit strange, didn't he, by the end of it? And Hiro is clearly not human. Sensei Mike gathered that very quickly. So that's starting to get somewhat interesting. But let's think about the fighting for a bit longer, for a moment. If you're not particularly well trained, you'd be inclined to do silly things in a fight, in a tournament fight. For example, wasting your energy, doing too many things. You'll often see people bouncing around too much and getting tired just from all that bouncing. They're certainly not hitting. And then the issue here is trying to be effective with your hits. When you try and initiate an attack, you actually want to hurt the opponent in front of you. You don't want to hurt their hands. You don't want to punch their hands. You want to punch that person. You want to maim them. This is the purpose of the exercise in a fighting tournament, or in a self-defense situation. So looking at these guys and assessing each one of these fights, we found the Silat guy was very mobile, very fast and zippy around the ring. He could move around and use the other person's strength to his advantage. He would grab their arm and climb around them and do things using their strength. Always useful if you can employ those techniques, particularly when you're fighting someone 2 or 3 times your size. We had the dragon, the Kung Fu dragon, who just mastered the soft way, and he knew how to control Steve for quite some time, until Steve had to sit back and reassess his fighting style against him. When someone fights soft, what you'll find is it's very easy to control someone. If I fight stiff like that and someone pushes this arm here, they can move my whole body. So you've got to learn to be loose and relaxed through your elbows and shoulders, and have some looseness so that you can respond to what this other guy's doing. If you're too tight, it's all over, guaranteed. They will control you. And then we came across the big guy. Cherry 1 was huge. What do you do when you fight against someone like that? And Steve seemed to have a plan. He was considering going in and meeting this guy punch for punch. The guy had a longer reach. You're going to fight some guy with a longer reach than you. He's going to hit you every time, and you're going to be lucky to get a punch in. So, not helpful unless you get right next to him. And do you really want to be right next to someone a head taller than you and possibly 20 or 30 kilos heavier? Perhaps not. So, I think Steve employed the right move. He kept kicking. The kicks were furious. You've got the distance of your kicks was perhaps slightly longer than the reach of this opponent's arms. So he was able to get his hits in without getting as many punches to his body. So that's a good thing. That was a clever move. Not much else to say about this chapter. It was a good set of fights. It was very exciting stuff. I'm going to let you in on a secret. I wasn't being the world's best author. These were basically experiences I personally had experienced in fighting tournaments, and I just wanted to relay some of my feelings and things that I'd experienced in my own fights along the way. Some of them, of course, were things I've learnt and seen since, but they're based on real fighting events and strategies that are employed in real tournament situations. Well, that was the end of chapter 3, the tournament. Well, once you win a tournament, you have to attend the presentation, and that is chapter 4, the presentation. I look forward to seeing you back for that. I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. We'll see you again, and please again subscribe and ring that bell so you know as soon as the next chapter is available for your excitement. Thanks again. See you soon. Bye.